The easiest victory to celebrate is often the one you never truly earned. Ethan Brooks lifted a crystal champagne flute before he had even stepped off the courthouse steps, the broad grin on his face inviting laughter from everyone gathered around him. His attorney clapped him on the shoulder. Two co-workers raised their phones to record the moment. Someone joked that freedom looked expensive, and Ethan answered with a confident smile that today had actually saved him a fortune. A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd while only a few yards away Claire Brooks quietly placed the final divorce papers into a plain manila folder without looking at anyone. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply adjusted the sleeve of her modest navy blazer as if this were any ordinary afternoon. That calm expression irritated Ethan more than any angry outburst ever could. He turned just loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You should have listened when I told you the world doesn't reward ordinary people." Another burst of laughter followed. Claire neither defended herself nor acknowledged the insult. Her silence only encouraged the audience. One woman whispered that she almost felt sorry for Claire until another answered that maybe she should have married someone closer to her own level. Ethan smiled even wider, believing every word confirmed what he had always thought. He had escaped a woman with no ambition, no connections, and no future worth sharing. The courthouse doors continued opening and closing behind them as lawyers hurried past, but Ethan barely noticed. His attention stayed fixed on the crowd, enjoying his victory. He wanted witnesses. He wanted everyone to remember this day as the day he walked away the winner. Claire slowly collected the small cardboard box holding the last items from the courtroom: a notebook, a pen, a family photograph turned face down, and the wedding band she had quietly removed hours earlier. She slipped the ring into the box without hesitation. That single motion drew a few curious looks, but Ethan interpreted it as surrender. "Guess reality finally caught up," he said, loud enough for strangers to hear. Another laugh. Another approving nod. Another reminder that status always attracted an audience. Claire finally looked at him. Her expression carried neither resentment nor regret. It was almost sympathy, and somehow that unsettled him more than tears ever could have. Before Ethan could say another word, the courtroom clerk hurried outside holding a folder against her chest. She scanned the entrance instead of the departing crowd, checked her watch twice, then quietly spoke into her phone. Her professional composure seemed to crack for only a second before she straightened her jacket and instructed two security officers to remain by the front doors. One of Ethan's friends noticed the unusual activity and joked that maybe another celebrity trial was about to begin. The officers didn't laugh. Neither did the clerk. Claire noticed everything but remained exactly where she was, patiently waiting as though she had expected the sudden change in atmosphere all along. Ethan mistook that patience for desperation. "Waiting won't change the judge's decision," he said with another smug smile. Claire answered softly, almost too quietly for anyone else to hear. "No, but sometimes the most important part begins after the decision." Ethan shook his head, amused by what sounded like denial. Behind them, several courthouse employees subtly turned toward the main entrance. Conversations faded. Footsteps slowed. Even experienced attorneys glanced toward the hallway with quiet curiosity. No one announced that someone important had arrived. No flashing cameras appeared. No dramatic commotion interrupted the afternoon. Yet the entire mood outside the courtroom shifted almost imperceptibly, as though people who spent every day inside that building had suddenly recognized a presence they respected. Claire lowered her eyes for only a moment and took one slow breath. Ethan never noticed. He was too busy celebrating a victory that, within the next few minutes, would begin to look very different from the one he believed he had won. Claire watched the courthouse entrance without moving while everyone else kept watching Ethan. The difference was almost invisible, yet it separated the only person who understood what was coming from everyone convinced the story had already ended. Ethan accepted another handshake, another congratulation, another joke about finally escaping a disappointing marriage. Every word made him stand a little taller. Every laugh convinced him that the courtroom had confirmed everything he had believed for years. Claire had brought nothing valuable into his life. She had never introduced influential friends. She had never worn designer labels. She had never spoken about family vacations in Europe or expensive business dinners. She drove an aging sedan until it finally stopped running. She volunteered on weekends instead of attending networking events. She clipped grocery coupons without embarrassment. Ethan had mistaken every one of those choices for proof that she came from an ordinary background. What he never realized was that every simple decision had been intentional. Years earlier, during the first months of their relationship, Claire had quietly told him that she wanted to build a life where people valued character before status. Ethan had smiled and called it romantic. As the years passed, romance slowly became frustration. He questioned why she refused expensive gifts from strangers. He laughed whenever she insisted on paying her own share at restaurants. He rolled his eyes when she chose community fundraisers over exclusive parties. More than once he asked why she never talked about her parents. Claire always answered with the same gentle smile. She believed that if someone truly loved her, they would never need an introduction to anyone else. Ethan eventually stopped asking because he believed the answer was obvious. If her family had mattered, surely they would have appeared by now. Back outside the courthouse, the crowd continued celebrating around him while Claire remained perfectly composed. Her attorney stepped beside her and quietly asked whether she still wanted to wait. Claire nodded once. There was no nervousness in her expression, only patience. The attorney looked toward the courthouse doors, checked his watch, and gave a respectful nod before stepping back. Ethan noticed the exchange and laughed. He loudly suggested that even her own lawyer was struggling to accept the outcome. Several people smiled with him, but their attention quickly drifted away as something subtle began changing around the entrance. Court employees who had been walking toward the parking lot suddenly turned back inside. A senior bailiff straightened his uniform and spoke softly into an earpiece. Two assistant clerks carefully adjusted a small table near the security checkpoint, even though the workday was nearly over. None of it seemed dramatic. None of it attracted immediate attention. Yet anyone familiar with the courthouse could sense that routine had quietly disappeared. Ethan ignored every sign. He was too busy explaining to his friends that he planned to celebrate all weekend. Claire gently closed the lid of her cardboard box and held it against her side. Her eyes briefly rested on the courthouse doors before returning to the afternoon sunlight. She did not look hopeful. She looked certain. That certainty finally caught Ethan's attention. For the first time all afternoon, the confidence on his face flickered. He frowned and asked why she was still standing there. Claire met his eyes with the same calm expression she had carried throughout the entire hearing. She answered softly that some people leave when the paperwork is finished, while others wait because the truth has not arrived yet. Before Ethan could laugh again, every conversation outside the courthouse stopped at once as a long black sedan rolled quietly to the curb, and every member of the courthouse staff instinctively turned toward the vehicle. The black sedan came to a smooth stop without attracting the kind of attention expensive cars usually demanded, yet something about its arrival changed the atmosphere more effectively than flashing lights ever could. The courthouse security officers immediately stood straighter. Two senior attorneys who had been walking toward the parking garage quietly stepped aside instead of continuing down the sidewalk. Ethan noticed the movement and laughed under his breath. He assumed another judge or local official had arrived. He lifted his champagne glass again and continued thanking everyone for celebrating with him. One of his friends joked that the mysterious guest should congratulate him as well, because winning a divorce this cleanly deserved an award. More laughter followed, but this time it sounded smaller than before. Claire remained exactly where she had been standing, holding the cardboard box with both hands. She did not turn toward the vehicle immediately. Instead, she watched the reflection of the afternoon sun shimmer across the courthouse windows as though she had rehearsed this moment many times in her mind. Her attorney quietly approached again and asked whether she was ready. Claire answered with a simple nod. There was no excitement in her face, only quiet certainty. Ethan frowned. He had expected tears by now. He had expected regret. Instead, she looked more composed than she had during the entire hearing. That confidence irritated him enough to walk a few steps closer. He asked whether she was still hoping someone would rescue her from reality. Claire looked at him calmly and answered that nobody was coming to rescue her because she had never been trapped. Before Ethan could reply, the rear passenger door of the sedan slowly opened. A silver-haired gentleman stepped onto the sidewalk wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and carrying nothing except a slim leather portfolio. There was no bodyguard surrounding him, no dramatic entrance, and no loud announcement of his identity. Even so, several courthouse employees instinctively greeted him with respectful smiles. One senior clerk hurried forward and quietly welcomed him by name, although the words were too soft for Ethan to hear. The gentleman acknowledged everyone with a polite nod before his eyes settled on Claire. His expression immediately softened into the warm smile of a proud father seeing his daughter after a difficult day. Claire returned that smile, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her all afternoon. Ethan froze for only a second before convincing himself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe the older man was one of Claire's former employers. Maybe he was a distant relative with little influence. Surely if he mattered, Claire would have mentioned him years ago. Yet the reactions around them continued to grow stranger. A judge who had already left the courtroom returned through the front doors and walked directly toward the gentleman with obvious respect. Several attorneys quietly stopped their conversations. Even Ethan's own lawyer looked surprised before quickly straightening his tie. Ethan noticed the change and finally lowered his champagne glass. For the first time since the divorce had been finalized, he stopped smiling. Claire took one calm step forward as the gentleman reached her. He gently placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder and asked only one question. He wanted to know whether she had kept her promise. Claire answered that she had done everything on her own from the first day of the marriage until the very last signature. The gentleman smiled with unmistakable pride. Ethan could not hear every word, but one sentence reached him clearly through the sudden silence surrounding the courthouse. The gentleman quietly said that she had nothing left to prove and that it was finally time for everyone else to learn who she really was. The silence lingered for several long seconds after the older gentleman spoke, and somehow that silence carried more weight than every celebration Ethan had enjoyed during the last hour. Claire lowered her eyes respectfully before answering that she had kept every promise she had ever made. She had built her own career, paid her own bills, accepted the court's decision without asking anyone to intervene, and walked through every difficult day exactly the way her father had taught her. The gentleman smiled with quiet pride and replied that he had never doubted her for a moment. Ethan looked from Claire to the older man, waiting for someone to explain why judges, attorneys, and courthouse staff suddenly behaved as though an honored guest had arrived. His attorney leaned slightly toward him and whispered that the gentleman looked familiar, although he could not immediately remember from where. Ethan shrugged and forced a laugh, insisting that appearances meant nothing. He even joked that expensive suits did not change divorce settlements. Nobody laughed this time. A senior judge walked down the courthouse steps, extended his hand to the older gentleman, and greeted him with genuine respect. Another attorney quietly stepped aside to allow the gentleman to pass first. Ethan watched the exchange with growing confusion. He had spent years trying to impress influential people in the business community, yet he had never seen professionals inside a courthouse react this way to anyone who was not a public official. Claire remained completely composed. She did not introduce her father. She did not attempt to embarrass Ethan. She simply stood beside the man who had arrived without fanfare and waited patiently. Her restraint made the moment feel even more unsettling. Finally, Ethan stepped forward and asked if someone intended to explain what was happening. The older gentleman turned toward him with a calm expression that held neither anger nor contempt. He politely introduced himself as William Hayes and thanked Ethan for taking care of Claire during the early years of their marriage. The words were gracious, but they landed awkwardly because everyone nearby seemed to recognize the name before Ethan did. His attorney suddenly inhaled sharply. One of the reporters near the courthouse entrance quietly lowered her camera and stared at William in disbelief. Ethan noticed every reaction except the one that mattered most. Claire never looked surprised because she had known this moment would eventually come. Ethan searched his memory, trying to place the name, but nothing came immediately. William did not rush to explain. Instead, he asked Claire whether she was satisfied that every legal matter had been resolved fairly. Claire answered that she was. She said she had wanted the court to see her exactly as she had lived for years, without privilege, without influence, and without anyone speaking on her behalf. William nodded approvingly and said that her mother would have been proud of the strength she had shown. Those words echoed through Ethan's thoughts. Without privilege, without influence. The sentence suddenly made him question every assumption he had made during the marriage. Before he could speak again, another black vehicle quietly pulled to the curb behind the first. Two professionally dressed executives stepped out carrying briefcases. They approached William with obvious respect, greeted him formally, and informed him that the board members had already arrived for the evening meeting but were prepared to wait as long as necessary. Ethan's attorney slowly turned pale. He finally remembered exactly where he had heard the name William Hayes before, and the realization drained every trace of confidence from his face. The expression on Ethan's attorney's face changed so completely that Ethan no longer cared about the executives or the waiting board meeting. He grabbed his attorney's arm and quietly asked who William Hayes really was. The attorney hesitated before answering, as though he could not believe the question had to be asked. He finally whispered that William Hayes was the founder of Hayes Global Holdings, a family enterprise whose investments reached hospitals, technology companies, commercial real estate, manufacturing, and charitable foundations across the country. Ethan stared at him in disbelief. The name suddenly unlocked memories of magazine covers, business interviews, and leadership conferences he had watched online for years. He had admired the company, studied its growth, and even applied for a management position at one of its subsidiaries several months earlier. The application had never received a response. Ethan slowly looked back toward Claire, struggling to connect the quiet woman who clipped grocery coupons with the daughter of one of the country's most respected business leaders. None of it made sense. If this had been true all along, why had she lived so simply? Why had she driven an old car? Why had she never mentioned private schools, luxury vacations, or exclusive connections? William seemed to recognize the questions forming in Ethan's mind before a single word was spoken. He gently turned toward Claire and said that she had honored their family's values better than anyone could have expected. He explained that years ago Claire had insisted on building a marriage without wealth influencing a single decision. She wanted to know whether someone would choose her for her kindness, her integrity, and her character alone. William admitted that he had disagreed with her at first because he feared she would be misunderstood, but he eventually respected her decision and promised never to interfere unless she personally asked for help. Claire quietly answered that she had never asked because the marriage had been her responsibility, not her father's. Ethan felt every sentence pressing against the version of reality he had confidently believed for years. Moments he once considered signs of weakness suddenly became evidence of remarkable discipline. Claire had never refused luxury because she could not afford it. She had refused it because she wanted an ordinary life. She had never hidden her family out of embarrassment. She had hidden them to protect the honesty of her relationships. Ethan remembered mocking her modest apartment before they married. He remembered telling friends that she lacked ambition because she preferred meaningful work over prestigious titles. He remembered accusing her of never understanding success. Every memory returned with painful clarity. William looked directly at Ethan, not with anger but with unmistakable disappointment. He calmly said that Claire had defended Ethan many times over the years whenever family members questioned his character. She believed people deserved patience while they built their futures. She believed humility could be learned. William admitted that he had hoped she was right. Claire lowered her eyes without saying a word. She did not appear interested in proving anyone wrong. She simply accepted the truth as it stood. Around them, the courthouse staff continued their work, yet the atmosphere had completely changed. The people who had laughed at Claire only minutes earlier now avoided meeting her eyes. Ethan noticed their silence and realized that nothing about the legal judgment had changed, yet everything about the balance of respect had. For the first time that afternoon, he understood that the greatest mistake of his marriage had never been the divorce itself. It had been believing that the value of the woman standing beside him could be measured by everything she had deliberately chosen not to reveal. No one spoke for several moments because the truth had already begun doing what arguments never could. Ethan looked at Claire as though he were seeing a completely different person standing in the same place. Every memory from their marriage seemed to rearrange itself in his mind. The modest apartment where she insisted they begin their life together had never been the only home she could afford. The used furniture they assembled together had never been a financial necessity. The weekends she spent volunteering instead of attending exclusive social events had never been evidence of limited opportunities. They had all been choices, deliberate choices. William quietly thanked the executives for waiting and assured them he would arrive shortly. They nodded respectfully without showing the slightest impatience before returning to the second vehicle. Ethan watched them leave and finally understood that powerful people were not impressed by displays of wealth. They respected William because of the man he was. Claire had inherited that same quiet confidence, yet Ethan had mistaken it for weakness throughout their marriage. His attorney cleared his throat and admitted that Hayes Global Holdings had a reputation unlike almost any other company in the country. It rarely recruited through public advertisements because many leadership positions were filled through long-term relationships and recommendations built on trust. Ethan felt his stomach tighten as another memory surfaced. Nearly a year earlier, Claire had casually asked him whether he would ever consider moving into a leadership role if the right opportunity appeared. He had laughed and answered that nobody opened those kinds of doors for ordinary people. Claire had simply smiled and changed the subject. At the time, he believed she was being unrealistic. Now he wondered whether she had already known that a door had been quietly waiting for him. William looked toward Ethan with the same measured calm he had shown since arriving. He said there was something Ethan deserved to know, not because it would change anything, but because Claire had earned the right to have the truth spoken aloud. William explained that before the marriage he had promised his daughter he would never use his name, his company, or his influence to shape Ethan's career. Claire wanted every achievement Ethan earned to belong entirely to him. She believed success gained through character would last much longer than success borrowed from family connections. Ethan lowered his eyes, unable to answer. William continued by saying there had been only one exception to that promise. About 8 months earlier, Claire had quietly asked whether Ethan's application to one of the company's subsidiaries could simply receive a fair review based on merit. She specifically requested that no special treatment be given. William agreed. The interview process began exactly as she requested. Ethan stared in disbelief because he had never known Claire had spoken on his behalf after all the arguments they had endured. William gently added that the hiring committee had been impressed by Ethan's professional qualifications. He had advanced further than hundreds of other candidates. Ethan's breathing slowed as hope briefly returned to his face. Then William finished the story. During the final review, an independent character assessment included feedback from several professional relationships and public interactions. The committee concluded that Ethan consistently underestimated people he believed had lower social status and often confused financial success with personal worth. The recommendation was withdrawn without William ever casting a vote. Claire quietly closed her eyes for a moment because she remembered how disappointed Ethan had been after receiving the rejection. She had wanted to comfort him then, but she could not explain the real reason without breaking the promise she had made years earlier. Ethan suddenly realized that the greatest opportunity of his career had not been taken away by bad luck. It had slipped through his own hands long before he ever knew it existed. The realization settled over the courthouse like a slow-moving shadow. Nobody needed to raise a voice anymore because every important truth had already been revealed. Ethan stood motionless with the untouched champagne glass still in his hand, suddenly aware that it now looked painfully out of place. Only minutes earlier it had symbolized victory. Now it seemed like evidence that he had celebrated far too soon. Claire quietly picked up the cardboard box containing the last pieces of her married life. It was still the same inexpensive box she had carried from the courtroom, and somehow that simple detail spoke louder than anything else. She had not arrived expecting luxury to defend her. She had arrived prepared to leave with only what belonged to her. William watched his daughter with unmistakable pride before turning back toward Ethan one final time. His voice remained calm, measured, and completely free of anger. He explained that wealth had never been the lesson he hoped Claire would learn. Character had always mattered more than influence. That was why he had honored her request to live independently after college, build her own career, rent her own apartment, and choose her own husband without interference from her family. Ethan listened in complete silence. William continued by saying that there had never been a secret test designed to make Ethan fail. No one had followed him. No one had manipulated his choices. Every decision Ethan made had been entirely his own. He had simply revealed his values one conversation at a time, one assumption at a time, one careless remark at a time. Claire had spent years hoping those values would change because she believed people could grow. William admitted that he had shared that hope for his daughter's sake. Unfortunately, hope could not replace consistent actions. Ethan slowly looked toward Claire, searching for anger, satisfaction, or even a trace of revenge in her expression. He found none of them. She looked tired, but peaceful. That quiet composure hurt far more than any accusation could have. Ethan finally managed to ask the question that had haunted him since William arrived. He wanted to know why Claire had never told him the truth. Claire answered gently that she had wanted to spend her life with someone who loved the woman standing beside him rather than the family standing behind her. She said that once she realized he constantly measured people by status, income, and appearances, revealing her background would have answered the wrong question. She never wanted to discover whether wealth could make someone stay. She wanted to know whether character alone would be enough. Ethan lowered his head because there was no honest response left to give. Around them, the small crowd quietly began dispersing. The same people who had laughed at Claire earlier now walked away without another word. Some avoided looking at her entirely. Others offered brief, respectful nods before leaving the courthouse steps. The celebration had disappeared as quietly as it had begun. William checked the time and reminded Claire that they should leave because the board meeting could wait no longer. Claire nodded, thanked her attorney sincerely for treating her with dignity throughout the proceedings, and shook his hand. Before turning away, she looked at Ethan one final time. There was no bitterness in her eyes, only the sadness that comes from accepting a truth that can no longer be changed. She softly told him that she genuinely hoped he would someday learn to recognize the value of people before judging the price of the things they owned. Then she turned toward the waiting car beside her father. Ethan remained exactly where he was, finally understanding that the legal papers ending the marriage had never been the most important judgment handed down that day. The real verdict had been written over years of ordinary choices, and it was one that no courtroom possessed the power to reverse. Claire placed the cardboard box gently inside the waiting sedan before pausing for one last look at the courthouse, where so much of her life had quietly come to an end. The afternoon sun reflected across the marble steps, making everything appear almost unchanged, yet she knew nothing about her future would resemble the years she was leaving behind. William opened the car door for his daughter with the same quiet courtesy he had shown her since she was a little girl. He did not rush her. He understood that some endings deserved a final moment of silence. Ethan finally found the courage to take a few hesitant steps forward. The confidence that had surrounded him earlier was gone, replaced by the uncertainty of a man realizing he had misunderstood the most important relationship of his life. He softly called Claire's name. She stopped walking but did not immediately turn around. Ethan apologized for the first time without excuses, without blaming circumstances, and without trying to defend himself. He admitted that he had spent years chasing appearances while overlooking the character of the woman standing beside him every day. Claire slowly faced him, her expression gentle but unchanged. She thanked him for the apology because sincere regret always mattered, but she quietly explained that apologies could heal wounds without rebuilding trust. Ethan nodded because he knew she was right. There were no dramatic speeches left to give. The marriage had not ended because of one terrible mistake. It had ended because countless small choices had slowly revealed what each of them valued most. William remained respectfully silent, allowing the conversation to belong entirely to the two people whose lives had shared so many years together. Around them, courthouse employees resumed their ordinary routines. Lawyers gathered briefcases. Reporters left in search of the next story. The excitement that had drawn curious spectators only an hour earlier had completely disappeared. What remained was something much quieter and far more lasting. Ethan glanced toward the champagne bottle resting on a nearby bench where his friends had forgotten it, while quietly slipping away. The celebration that had seemed so important now looked strangely empty. None of the people who had laughed with him earlier remained by his side. Claire noticed where he was looking, but said nothing. She had learned long ago that some lessons only become meaningful when discovered alone. William gently reminded Claire that the board members were still waiting. She smiled and apologized for keeping everyone longer than expected. William answered that important people never measured time the way ordinary schedules did, because some moments deserve patience. Ethan heard those words and realized that true influence had never been loud. It never needed to announce itself. It simply arrived with quiet confidence and allowed actions to speak. Claire reached into the cardboard box one final time and removed the small framed photograph that had rested face down throughout the afternoon. It showed happier days from the beginning of their marriage when hope had still outweighed disappointment. She looked at it for only a few seconds before handing it to Ethan. She told him it belonged with his memories now because she had decided to carry only the future. Ethan accepted the photograph with trembling hands, understanding that it was not a punishment but a farewell. Claire offered one final sincere smile before stepping into the sedan beside her father. As the vehicle quietly pulled away from the courthouse, Ethan remained standing on the empty steps holding nothing except a forgotten photograph and the painful realization that the greatest loss of his life had not been money, opportunity, or status. It had been the quiet woman who had loved him enough to give him every chance to become a better man before finally choosing to walk away with her dignity still completely intact. 6 months later, the courthouse had become nothing more than a distant memory, but the lesson from that afternoon continued shaping two very different lives. Claire walked through the headquarters of Hayes Global Holdings without fanfare, carrying the same quiet confidence she had carried while living in a modest apartment. The employees greeted her warmly, not because she was the founder's daughter, but because she had earned their respect long before accepting a leadership role within the family foundation. She spent her mornings reviewing scholarship applications, meeting community leaders, and expanding programs that helped young entrepreneurs build businesses without sacrificing integrity. The same kindness that had once gone unnoticed inside her marriage had become the quality people admired most. William often watched his daughter from across the conference room with quiet satisfaction. He had built a successful company, but seeing Claire remain humble despite every advantage made him believe his greatest achievement had never been measured on a financial statement. Across the city, Ethan's life looked very different from the future he once imagined. He still worked hard, but every interview, every business meeting, and every new relationship reminded him how easily pride could blind someone to genuine character. The rejection from Hayes Global Holdings no longer felt unfair. It felt earned. Instead of blaming bad luck, he slowly began changing the habits that had defined him for years. He listened more carefully. He judged people less quickly. He volunteered at a local community center on weekends after remembering how often Claire had invited him to join her. Nobody there knew anything about his divorce or the courthouse. They only knew a man trying to become better than he had been yesterday. One autumn afternoon, Ethan attended a charity gala hosted by the Hayes Foundation. He had been invited through his volunteer organization, never expecting to see familiar faces. Across the ballroom, he noticed Claire speaking with students whose education had been funded through one of the foundation's scholarship programs. She was dressed elegantly, yet nothing about her demeanor had changed. She still gave every person her full attention regardless of their title or background. For a brief moment their eyes met across the room. Claire smiled politely, the kind of warm smile one offers someone whose chapter in life has already reached its natural ending. Ethan returned the smile with quiet gratitude. Neither of them walked toward the other because there was nothing left that needed to be said. They had both become different people, but only one of them had discovered that peace long before the marriage ended. As the evening concluded, William stepped onto the stage to thank the guests for supporting the foundation. Instead of speaking about wealth or success, he spoke about character. He reminded everyone that the strongest people were often those who never needed to prove how important they were. Ethan listened carefully because he finally understood every word. Leaving the event, he noticed a framed quote displayed near the exit that members of the foundation passed every day without much thought. It read, "Dignity does not shout. It glows." Ethan paused for a long moment before quietly walking into the cool evening air. He had once believed winning meant standing above someone else. Now he understood that real victory belonged to the person who could leave with kindness, integrity, and self-respect still intact. Claire had never returned to reclaim the marriage. She had never sought revenge. She had simply remained true to herself until the truth became impossible for anyone else to ignore. And in the end, she did not win because her father walked into the courthouse. She won because she never needed his name to know her own worth.